Thank you for joining us today. My name is Haley Deshane and I'm the events coordinator here at Eco Canada. Welcome to Accountable Leadership in Action Part 2, Document.
Welcome to day 2. Hopefully a lot of you were already joining on day 1, which was listening. So day 2 today, we're going to go on to documentation and how you can create a trail of accountability for yourself. Like I said, day 1 was all about listening well, and this brings us into how do you document what you listened to, what you heard. And it's going to give you a framework on how to create a credible, verifiable record. Okay. So that brings us to the question of why is documentation even important? Why does it matter? Well, we can tell you a lot of stories and bring up a lot of files that we've worked on, and your memory is not as good as you think it is. And especially when you think about by the time that an issue escalates and whether that issue then becomes part of a future investigation or something that you need to speak to or provide your documentation to avoid an investigation or have it to not go any further. If you're relying on your memory of what happened, what you heard, what you documented, you're not going to set yourself up for any sort of success. So that's the purpose of today, is to kind of instill in you that your memory is not always ideal to rely upon, and that there's actual expectations and compliance obligations, especially in the eco field, to document well and to document thoroughly and to not rely on your memory. So throughout the course of this investigation, we'll go over that a lot because there are expectations with the courts as well, like the best evidence rule, stuff like that, that talks to how pivotal documentation is and the types of documentation you need to have and what makes good documentation and what makes poor documentation. Before I go any further, just because we're on the topic of evidence and documentation, I'm going to ask them to load into the chat. Canly will become one of your best friends. You can search it online. It's got all of the decisions. You can go in there and you can type it in by different category. I've provided a couple of cases that I'm going to be referring to in the chat. And it basically, it's going to allow us to reverse engineer this entire presentation. It's going to let you show when a decision comes down and it's published, you can read that and see what the judge had to say. And then in there, you'll get to see all of the things that the investigator relied upon and how they brought it from facts to findings and what that meant both for the individuals that were documenting or not documenting appropriately and what it meant for the organizations that they actually work for. So in terms of your protection, it's not only your individual protection, it's the protection of whatever organization that you're working for, or even the industry that you represent. So if you're a PN or if you're an environmental tech, or if you work offshore, and you're really concerned about marine pollution, and you're documenting your compliance obligations under all of that, your not only yourself, your organization, but your professional body will need to be protected as well. And ultimately, it's your responsibility. No one's going to document for you. And if the investigators like myself come knocking on your door looking for documentation, I'm going to expect for you to produce it. So before I go on to your individual documentation, I want to just cover off baseline documentation. So think about it as what did you need for your job? So a lot of times when you're a new hire, you've probably seen this a lot. You go in on your first day, first thing you've got to do is sign. Let's say you're on a mining camp, you're gold mining with a company and you're the environmental tech on site. They're going to ask you to sign confidentiality agreements saying whatever samples you take, whatever work you do, that you're not going to share any of that information. They're going to ask you to sign that. They're going to keep a copy. Code of conduct. In most workplaces now, whether it's in the eco industry or if it's in federal government, provincial government, private practices, a lot of people will have signed code of conduct. So what's expected in the workplace? Remote access agreements, if you're using your computer or equipment off-site, what's that looks like? What can you do online? What can you not look at online? And even things like training logs. So like today, if this was a mandatory training for you to have at work, they would expect you to produce, did you attend? Did you get a certificate of completion? And if this was a company event, they would keep a log of everyone in the room, and that would become part of their baseline documentation. And it gets really important when it comes to things like harassment in the workplace. Part of harassment policies and respectful workplace policies speak to, are people trained? Did the organization provide them an opportunity for training? Have they been trained recently, or was their last training 15 years ago? Basically, was the individual in question of an investigation, were they aware of what was expected of them? And sometimes the lack of documentation speaks for itself. So a lot of times people think evidence are the things that we collected. Sometimes evidence can be the absence of something collected, something that should have been there but wasn't. Or it could be that the investigator finds that they asked for 15 different things and none of it existed. Or perhaps all other employees except this one could produce documentation and this person couldn't. That would speak to more of an individual issue than a systemic issue. So those are all of the reasons why baseline documentation. So this is like organization-wide documentation that applies to everyone in all instances, not an individual event. Let's say there was an oil spill, or let's say someone got injured at work in that moment. These are the documentations that would be baseline prior to that incident or event happening. Demonstrable accountability, very big deal right now in industry and also within the courts. So what that means is that organizations must show concretely, backed by evidence, how they met legal requirements. It's not enough to say, yeah, we did something, or we're sure all of our people are aware of their obligations, or whatever, legal requirement is that they have. You need to show, backed by evidence, where this documentation session is going to hammer this home. You need to show it to be true, not just say that it's true. So when an incident happens, investigators will ask for, what were the baseline policies? What are your day-to-day practices? What procedures do you have in place? And then they're going to ask how you complied with them. So it's not enough to just, when everyone comes in on day one, sit them down and say, all right, here's your respectful workplace policy, sign this, sign that. They're also going to expect that this is monitored and audited, and that people get updated training, and that there are, things in place to show that all of these things that they have, that they're working as they're intended. So before I go any further into facts to findings, and again, that case law document that they loaded into the chat from Canley, if you go in and look at those, you're going to see terms like facts and findings used quite a bit. They're also going to talk, very much in detail about what the expectations were and what kind of materials, were collected by the investigator and what that meant for the investigation. But before I even go into that in a little bit more detail, I just want to do a quick poll and to find out which framework do you work under? So are you all from the environmental industry? Are you in a support role to the environment? And you can even put a comment in there as well about do you work under ISO, those sorts of things. So I'm just going to put that into the poll question there. We'll get back to that just in a little minute. Just give you guys a chance to do that. Okay, so we'll get back to that just in a minute. So if we're going to go through this slide right now, so one thing that we always say, so whether we're writing an investigative report at the end or we're just, having a discussion with management on where they want to be or how they want to move forward with whatever issue they come to us with, you have to know the facts. So an example would be the employee completed the mandatory respectful workplace training on April the 2nd, 2024. Okay, so that's a fact. So that's what management would say to us. And the employee could say, I was trained on this. Okay, but we're going to say, what is the baseline documentation to show that that is correct? So there could be an attendance log saying that they attended, but that doesn't tell the full story. We still need to know specifically, well, what did they attend? What was discussed? What did the training material look like? So we can collect training material. It also has to tie into, if we're trying to determine, did the person have an expectation? What documentation shows they met that expectation? But it's also going to always tie back to some sort of a policy that sets what's needed and what the accepted conduct in the workplace is. So that's where we'll go after respectful workplace policies, stuff like that. So then the finding will be the employee was aware and trained on the harassment-free workplace policy at the time of the alleged incident. So this is also relevant because when we look for documentation, it's the documentation itself, but we also look at other things like the metadata within it. When was it dated? If it's so electronic, let's say something was uploaded, we're going to look to see when it was created, modified, stuff like that. We're also going to look if there's if they signed documentation, what date was it signed on? Because that could be relevant if this all happened after the incident in response to versus all of these things were in place ahead of time. And then we won't only look towards the individual if they were aware of and trained on the policy. We're going to see if the organization can demonstrate that the employee was informed of the workplace expectations, provided with relevant resources and materials, and how. So we look at both sides, the individual and the organization. Okay, so I'm just going to give you just a minute to ponder this if we could. So who would you rather be? So if when you review this case, this particular case in Canley, or you look at other ones, or you get to, read about a workplace investigation in the news, or you even see it on TV, and they're talking about the actual consequences of something and what was found after something was investigated. So would you rather be Eco Team 1? That says Eco Team 1 demonstrated that information systems were in place at the time of the breach and provided 9 supporting documents. Let's call them documents X, Y, and Z. And as the investigator, I find that they took reasonable steps to protect the client data and complied with their information practices. Would you be happy if I came in and did an investigation because there was an alleged breach of sensitive mining data and all of the secrets of the mining company were put it on Facebook. And at the end of the day, would you want that written about you or your team? Would you be happy with that? Or I come in as the investigator for Eco Team 2, because it had to be one team or the other that breached this information and released these million-dollar questions. Eco Team 2 had no information systems in place at the time of the breach and provided no supporting documentation, operating without policies, procedures, or systems in a serious non-compliance with the Act. No reasonable steps were taken to protect client data, and I find Eco Team 2 in breach of Section 8 of the Act. So a lot of times from this example, you'll see that it's tied back to your industry and what you're working under. So if you are working in an ISO system, ISO sets compliance obligations about things like mitigating waste, documenting, disposing of certain waste. So if you were to, apply it to this scenario, it might be an investigation if a major spill happened or waste was disposed of in such a way that it shouldn't have been. And if we come in and do the investigation and we say Eco Team 2 had no systems in place, they had no documentation, they were operating without policies, procedures, or systems, they were in serious non-compliance, and it could be that act could be like a variety of acts. So whether you're working in the Maritime Act or even if it ended up injuring an animal under the Animal Health Act, there could be a ton of acts applicable based on where you work and what you do. We're always going to tie it back to that act. But regardless, I would not want to be on Eco Team 2. Because if you remember right back to at the beginning of the presentation when we talked about it being your responsibility and your protection, just imagine being on Eco Team 2, what the next day at 8 a.m. is going to look like. You may be walking out with a box. You may be called to testify in court. There could be criminal charges laid if it ended up resulting in a death or a serious spill or something like that. Documentation is very, very important. And step one, before they talk about the incident or the event in particular, there was always that tie back to how are they operating? What did their policies look like? What did their procedures look like? What do their systems look like? Were their people trained? Do they have documentation of the training? Were the expectations known? Were they met? Those are all baseline things that we cover off in terms of documentation long before we even look at the who, what, when, where, why, and the individual documentation that comes a little bit later. So without baseline documentation, you have no foundation. I would not want to be Eco Team 2 being met by the regulatory investigators or the police to talk about what went down when they have nothing. I would not want to be put in that situation myself personally. And it's not just about the actual incident. It's not just the oil spill or the injury at work or the harassment complaint. That's not the time to be playing catch up and trying to get systems, policies, procedures, and baseline documentations in place. That's supposed to already be into effect long before an incident or an event happens. And if it's not, the investigators are going to get to the bottom of that, and they're going to speak to that baseline documentation that was great if you're Eco Team 1, or the poor baseline documentation if you were Eco Team 2. So key questions that you get from the investigators, regulators, and the courts: what was the policy? How did you train staff? And how can you prove it? So I would love for you to go back to your own organizations or just look at your own career and think about, wow, if I had an investigation tomorrow, do I have my own record of my own training? Would I be able to put my hand on whatever policies I should be having? Those sorts of things. So please, long before there's an event or an incident, at least make sure at the very least that your baseline documentation is tidy and ready to go. You can't control what happens tomorrow. You can't, you can't predict that an oil spill might happen or someone might get injured. You can't prepare for that in a lot of ways, but you can, at a very minimum, show that you do have baseline documentation. So when you think back at the listening day, we talked about listening, what the issues are, listening if you have an incident or an event that's escalating, and noting, was this person given a verbal warning? Because that should be documented. Were they given a written warning? Because that should also be documented. Was there a previous formal investigation that was done with this person? Again, all really good documentation. But I do want to make the point that in some cases, not every disciplinary action needs to be taken. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that the documentation needs to show, all the escalation steps. Sometimes, given the seriousness of the event, if there was, say, a workplace violence incident, you don't need to go through the documentation of, I gave them a verbal and then it was written. Like, it can go straight to formal investigation. You don't need to follow it in a linear way. Okay, John, I'm going to hand that off to you now.
Okay, thank you. So Lorianne spent some time talking about baseline documentation, how important it is for your organization. So what I want to do is now talk about your personal documentation. How do you write things down? So the very first thing is contemporaneous. So, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, so I'm not going to spend any time with that. How complete is your documentation? So we're going to share. We're going to revisit the scenarios that we spoke about in the first presentation on the listening. So we're going to go back to those, and this time we're going to look at some documentation, and some good and not so good. So we look at, is your documentation accurate? And all of these will or could impact the credibility of your documentation. So is it timely, periodic, attributable? So who wrote it? Who created it? Who entered it? Was it modified? Because sometimes we'll see documentation, we have no idea who wrote it or who put it in. There's no initials. So is it secure? And trust me, you do not want to be the person that has secure documentation or sensitive documentation that is not secure. And we hear about it all the time. I know from the policing days, it happened as well, where this information was in the vehicle back in my day in briefcases, or it's just a folder in your car because you're just going to duck in quickly to the bank or to go have a coffee, and guess what, your car gets broken into or stolen, and then there's issues because now all of a sudden this information is out there. So also templates, are they available? And is your documentation communicated? If so, what does that look like? So if we can go to the next slide. There we go. So weak personal documentation that we have seen. So there's no notes or the documentation is incomplete. So entries, they're written late. There's no notation, again, who did this. Checklist style reporting of tasks that are not done. There's copied text or auto charting. There's vague statements that we look at, and I'm not spending a lot of time on this because we're going to get into it in future slides here. So we want to see, we want to avoid personal opinions in there, because it just takes away from credibility. It takes away from professionalism a lot of times. So don't use unclear shorthand. We see acronyms all the time, and we spend most of the, it seems like we spend most of the investigation trying to figure out what these acronyms mean. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Okay, so at the end of this slide, something will become very apparent, is how do you know? So if somebody said, oh, there was a car crash out today on the Trans-Canada Highway, my question is always, how do you know that? Did they hear it from someone? Did they see it? It makes a lot of difference, right? Documentation tips, who was involved, right? If all of a sudden you're speaking to someone and they say, oh, Lorianne was there, John was there, well, okay, excellent. How do you know that they were there? And maybe they heard about it. Maybe they had a dream about it. Who knows? Okay, where and when? Again, how do you know? Objective description, not assumptions. We want to know what you saw, what you heard. Your response or action taken. Because a lot of times what we'll see in documentation is, you know, people try to be very good at writing down what they saw, but they don't write down or they don't document what steps that they took. And that often will add some color to an otherwise black and white photograph. So, and also it's important to see what you didn't see, right? And you can think about that in your own organizations of what's important, right? You come home and you don't see your alarm system on, which you always have it on. Okay, that tells you something. Okay, so contemporaneous notes. So what I want you to think about is, if you were to write down today some notes, and they don't have to be really detailed, but if you wanted to make some notes on what Lorianne and I are sharing with you today. So you're doing it right now. And so you could revisit that in a week or maybe a month, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's what they talked about. It may not be really clear, but you have some notes on it. Well, or I challenge you, I want you to wait for 2 months. Well, maybe even 2 days, 2 weeks. And then I want you to make notes on what we talked about today. And that should hit home the importance of documentation, the importance of timely documentation. Okay, so contemporaneous is notes should be made as close to the event as possible. Now, why is that? Well, because it helps your memory. Okay, so contemporaneous documents is far more persuasive to the courts or to whoever is an arbitrator, somebody down the road that's looking at this information, because it adds credibility to it. Okay. So what we do is when we're doing documentation, and you'll see this later, is mark the date and the time that you're doing that the note was created. Now electronically, and Lorianne will get into this later, but you'll see in a scenario here where it's actually written down what time the notes were taken, because that tells a story, because otherwise you don't know when they were taken. It could have been made yesterday, although the incident was a year ago. So investigator insight is the courts, the tribunals, they give more weight to contemporaneous notes. So I'll give you another example a little bit later. Okay, so integrity. So at the end of the day, you want your notes to be credible. You want to be believed. You don't want an investigator to sit there and go, I don't know about this person. There's some red flags here. So we don't edit, we don't erase, or we don't overwrite notes. What you should do is you should strike through it, just put a line through it, initial it, and then put what you want to do. Right? The days of the whiteout are gone. So the other thing that you want to do is for digital files is you rely on the version control or the hashing to improve or to prove integrity. And Lorianne will talk about the metadata later. And for the people involved or have been involved in the healthcare system, so this example here, the EMR credentials not shared. So maybe in your organization you see this too, because right now, like if I'm in your organization and I'm going to enter that this safety check was done, but Lorianne is the one that we always use her credentials, right? Because that's what's on, maybe underneath the computer, or I might forget my password. So it's easy. We just keep one computer system up and running all the time, so that we don't have to put our own information in there. Well, that's a problem, because when we come in as investigators, we're looking at it, and it would appear that Lorianne did all the checks. She did all the safety checks. Now, did she? Now, because when we go back and we look at the schedule to confirm that she was working that day, well, guess what? She was on holidays. So now all of a sudden we have an integrity issue, because the safety checks, were they done? We can't really put any stock in they're done, because it says that Lorianne did it. So that's not a good thing. So your credibility, right? At the end of the day, you want to be credible and you want to be reliable. We will we'll talk later in the next session on acting and doing investigation. We do a lot of disservice to witnesses if we don't ask questions properly, because we affect their reliability. And they might be working really hard, but in the policing world, it happens all the time. In investigations, it happens all the time, because you say to someone, did you see a red truck? Now, that's our statement versus what did you see, right? Because we've told them that there's a vehicle that's is colored red, and it's a truck. Now, later, when they go to court and they say, well, yeah, I saw a red truck, the courts might not put any weight on what they said, because we're the ones that, or the police are the ones that told them that. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So again, we talked a little bit about this. You can expect, when there's an incident and investigators are called in, they're going to look at your baseline documentation. They're going to look at your personal documentation. And it's like, are there notes? Are the notes contemporaneous? Are the notes neutral? Or does it appear that the person, the author of this, if we know who that is, do they seem to have a bit of a grudge or an issue? And you think about it right now. If you were to look on Facebook and somebody said, there's a problem in this area with ATVs. They're always going up and down the street at all times, and I'm concerned that because there's kids playing, and I'm concerned that they're going to hurt the kids, or they themselves will get hurt. Okay, I can read that, and I'm like, okay, I can understand that. But if I see somebody and they're just full of vile comments, and they're like, and they make some like very harsh judgment, like these people should be hung up. I'm going to put piano line on the road, and I'm going to hurt these people. I just lose any interest in what their message, and their message may be intended to be a good message, but the way that they deliver it and that. So the same thing with documentation. Just be careful on how you make notes. So the safest way, the best way, is to be neutral. And do the notes align with the records? So And that's what investigators do, is they will take your notes. I know from our perspective, what we do is we look at the notes and we think we start with the position that those notes are accurate. What you wrote is accurate, and we look at for evidence to corroborate your notes. But if all of a sudden now we can't find that evidence and somebody else tells us something different, or we're seeing red flags in those notes, now all of a sudden that could impact your credibility. Okay, so let's go into, okay, so the beyond liability protection. So documentation will tell the story, what has been done. It'll tell about the steps taken, and you want to ensure that the next person has the best information. Okay, strong documentation is strong safety. Okay, let's go back. Let's go into the scenario. And for those of you that were in the first session, you will remember Joanne. For those of you that are just joining us today, I'll just read this out. So Joanne is a summer student. She's working in the field on a reclamation site. Sam, an HSE lead and long-term employee, is also on site. Joanne approaches you. She's visibly upset, red eyes. She's struggling to catch her breath, and she reports that Sam commented on her hair and leaned in to smell it. So if we were in person doing this presentation, it probably would work a little bit better, but we're gonna roll with it here. So what I want you to do is just consider what documentation should be created in this situation. So you can think about your organization, what documentation, what baseline documentation would be important. And when investigators come in and they ask for how this report, they ask you how you assess this report, how you did your documentation, how would that look? So this is one example. I was preparing for another meeting when the new employee approached me and said that Sam had made a comment that bothered her. I told her I was busy and would try to look into it, though I doubted anything would come of it. About a week later, I spoke with Sam. We have a good working relationship and I trust his word more than hers. He said the new employee was a bit of a smoke show, in quotes, which we both laughed about. He denied saying anything to her directly. I considered the matter closed. So a good little tip is to think about the 6 o'clock news. Would you want your documentation to be shown on the 6 o'clock news? Right? If it's done properly, shouldn't be an issue. But looking back, would you want, do you think this documentation that was done, do you think is appropriate? So when you look through it, who wrote it? You have no idea who wrote it. When did they write it? Not sure. And do you think that they took Joanne's concerns? Did you think they took it serious? Doesn't look like it to me. And as investigators, we come in and we look at this information, and this is the type of documentation that we find. So if you're doing this type of documentation, I'd strongly ask you to, or urge you to do better. Okay, so this we look at is a better way to do it. So notes of John Wilson, August 12th, 2025 at 9:31 a.m. This morning at 9 a.m. So right there, what does that tell you? It tells you that John Wilson is doing notes 31 minutes after he learned of this information. So talk about contemporaneous. Joanne Carter, a new summer student, came to my office and asked if she could talk to me about something that was bothering her. I invited her to sit down and close the door to provide privacy. So again, later on, when somebody is looking at this, if this was to go to a court or wherever it ends up going, what does this demonstrate? It demonstrates that you are providing her a safe place to share information, which if you think back to the very first presentation that we did on listening, this is exactly what we wanted people to do. Ann Walsh approached to discuss a project. I let her know I'd need to reschedule. Ann greeted Joanne and then raised her eyebrows at me before leaving. Okay, so what have I done there? I've identified another person. So later on, the investigators would know Ann also was there. And what would Ann have done? She would have saw Joanne that was in my office. That is corroboration. And what that does is it speaks to credibility of your documentation. Joanne's eyes were red and she was visibly upset and struggling to catch her breath, a noticeable change from her usual cheerful demeanor. So again, what we're doing is we're trying to paint a picture for people later on to look at this. She told me that Sam had commented on how beautiful her hair was, leaned in too close, smelled it, and said it smelled really good. I thanked Joanne for trusting me with this information, assured her that this behavior would be taken seriously, and informed her that we would initiate an investigation. So again, it's not only about what happened, but if you think back to a few slides earlier, what steps were taken to address this? So if anybody was to look at this investigation or this incident, do they think that number one, it was treated fairly, like Joanne was treated fairly, that she was taken seriously, and that there were steps put in order to reassure her? She knows what's going to happen. She has a bit of a roadmap. So I offered to connect her with the Employee Assistance Program, and she accepted. I spent approximately 45 minutes with Joanne and initiated an investigation later that morning. Okay. So when you think back about that now, as I'm reading through it, if I spent 45 minutes with her, that means that my notes would have been started while she was still with me. Okay, so let's go to scenario 2. Susan is a medic working with an environmental crew in the field. She confided in a coworker that she felt uncomfortable driving alone with Aaron. So Aaron, as you will remember, he's the foreman. During the drive, Aaron had allegedly touched Susan's leg and said, "Do you want to play the red light, green light game?" He explained that he would stop if she said red light, otherwise he would continue. This kind of disclosure requires clear, timely, and objective documentation. Investigators would want to know what was reported, when, to whom, and what steps. So again, and these are things that happen. Now we change obviously locations or names. So we look at the documenting. So a female medic reported feeling unsafe around one of our top employees, Aaron. The work environment is male dominated, but all concerns must be taken seriously. I met with her, but based on my experience and intuition, I believe she was not being truthful. I reminded her that false accusations could harm Aaron's reputation and family. While I'm hopeful this will be the last unfounded complaint, we must continue to monitor the situation carefully to protect everyone's integrity. So what do you think about that one? Is that the type of documentation that you would want? No, there's so many things wrong with that. Personal opinions are in there. So right away, I took Aaron's side, right? But you really don't know who wrote it. So versus notes of Ann Walsh, August 30th, 2025, 11:31 a.m. This morning at approximately 10:45 a.m., Susan Brown, medic on environment crew number 2, approached me in the rear parking lot at 911 Bison Way. She asked if I was in HR, and when I confirmed, she said she was freaked out by her foreman, Aaron Pierce. Susan explained that yesterday afternoon, Aaron offered her a ride from Site 1 to Site 4. It was just the two of them in Aaron's red jacked up Dodge, and the drive lasted about 14 minutes. During the drive, Aaron reached over and placed his right hand on the inside of Susan's left knee. He said they were going to play a game of green light, red light, explaining that he would continue moving his hand up her leg until she said red light. Susan became emotional and started crying as she shared this. John Wilson passed by and would have heard Susan say, "I cannot believe he would do this to me." I thanked Susan for trusting me with this information and assured her the behavior would be taken seriously. I informed her that an investigation would be initiated. Susan declined an offer to speak with the Employee Assistance Program. I spent approximately 45 minutes with her and initiated an investigation that afternoon. So again, that's the type of documentation that you should be trying to achieve. Okay, a lot of good things in there. Okay, so be detailed, date everything. Okay, documentation should be clear, objective, verifiable. We want the date and time for every entry. So if you're, what we'll find sometimes, we go into an investigation and we say, okay, what we're looking for is all documentation that you have in relation to John Wilson. Okay, so I get, a bunch of different information, maybe Word perfect documents, whatever it is, but there's no date or time. But it says, well, today I did this, yesterday I did that. So we don't know. Or is somebody say on June 10th, 2025, at this time, this is what I saw. Okay, we need to know who wrote it. What's your role? Avoid vague language. They seemed upset, or they're not really a team player. Okay, identify corroboration. So again, in those earlier scenarios, the purpose of adding John Wilson in as a witness or Lori Ann Walsh was to just demonstrate that you're identifying witnesses. Witnesses can help tell the story. Does it corroborate it or does it refute it? Okay, we look at pictures, screenshots, emails. Okay, Lorianne?
Okay, so you can see from what we're asking that detail is everything, right? You want to be as detailed as possible, really wholesome notes from the organizational point of view and the personal. But to every rule, there's an exception. So I just want to touch on this very briefly. So it is true you want to give as much detail as possible, but, and this is the one exception, everything that you collect, you're responsible for, okay? And you should only be collecting what you have a right to have. So examples would be, there would be a very rare instance where you would be asking for someone's social insurance number if you were trying to write documentation or get information about an event. I would say that would not be something you would want to collect. And if you did, you'd have to be very, very careful about how you were securing that. Health information, again, you'd be very careful for that. And do you even need to collect it? Same thing with personal addresses and phone numbers. And to this point, like as investigators, because we're used to always having to produce our records, so every time we document something, we know it's going to have to be produced. Anything personal like that, we use a notebook, like a left and right hand side notebook. All of the notes go in the right. But if we have something that we know we're going to have to protect or remove from something before it's released, we'll keep that on the left hand side. So if we ever have to go through and vet our notes or prepare them for disclosure, anything personal is on the left, it's easy to come out. If there's missing pages in our notes, we make a note of that. So you would cross it out and initial it. You wouldn't rip the page out because we want to figure out if there's anything missing. So in terms of minimal use and consistent use, yes, we want rich detail, but be very careful about things you should not be collecting or you have no authority to collect, or if you collect them, that you have to be very, very careful with how you store them and how you might disclose them down the road. So that's just a little caveat, the exception to the general rule. Another thing to be just mindful about when you're creating documentation or gathering documentation is metadata. So if you have an electronic record, we look at the notes themselves. Let's say that there was a Microsoft Word document, which was your electronic notes of an event. Or it could be, let's say, in the environmental industry, as part of your ISO compliance obligations, you have to do a once per hour checklist. And you go through and you check, yes, 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 everything was good to go. And you date it, Ann Walsh, on today's date, November 20th. Okay, so that's the record. But the investigators also look for the metadata. So we're going to go in and say, okay, so this document was created on November the 20th by Ann Walsh. Whose login was used to create that? Was it someone else? What does it say the created date was? What's the modified date? Those sorts of things as well. Just be aware that we will look for those as well. If there was pictures or anything as part of an event, it's going to be able to show what device that was taken from and any properties of that device. Just to be aware that when you're providing, creating, or producing documentation, that is also looked at by investigators. So this is another metadata scenario. A supervisor submits an incident report on the 2nd. It shows that the created date and modified date were different dates. And sometimes that happens, and that is okay, but there has to be a note that speaks to the revision or the change or whatever happened as to why those things don't line up. Sometimes that's just life and that's the way it is, but you got to be very careful about overly documenting any sort of an inconsistency, because the investigators right away are going to flag that as a credibility concern, or at least a discrepancy that they need to go drill down into and look at a little bit more. So documentation red flags are performance and practice red flags. So if we go into a group and we see that there's all kinds of issues, whether it's a bunch of missing documentation or things that don't add up or are not consistent with other things, that's going to create a red flag for the documentation, but it's also going to create a red flag for the employee, their performance, and maybe the organization overall. And if it wasn't documented, it doesn't exist in our world. So your memory won't have the same credibility as what was documented at the time. And document with care, making sure that you're documenting actually what happened. You're documenting facts. You're not documenting your assumptions about what happened. And John, I'm going to hand that back to you for the credibility assessment.
Okay, and you guys will get a copy of this, so I'm not going to go through it in great detail. Just trying to be mindful of the time. One thing that I will talk about though is the care that's taken into the report. I thought I had one of the scenarios documented poorly, but we'll see reports sometimes, and it is just riddled with poor grammar, spelling mistakes. It looks like the person that wrote it didn't care at all about it. So when we see that, right away, that's a red flag, because and we've seen it through investigations that have been done by different organizations, and the very first thing that comes to mind is, if this is how they're not even taking care doing a report, or like documenting something, what kind of investigation do they do? And they might have done a great investigation, but it just looks at it, it comes across that they don't know what they're doing when it's like that. So first impressions are so important. If I, it's the same thing. You might be a really good worker, but if your resume and your job application is full of spelling mistakes and it looks like you didn't care, well, guess what? You're probably not going to get an interview. So the last one that I'll talk about is acting. So is your documentation strong enough to trigger or withstand an investigation? Okay, does the evidence in your, what you've uncovered, does it warrant an investigation? And if so, what kind of investigation? Do you have proper documentation for the investigators? And we'll be getting into this into the next presentation. But if you're going to do the investigation, do you have somebody there that has the wheels and the ability to do that? So what's happened is we've seen here today about proper documentation. It's not just about the best practice. It's the foundation for a fair, compliant, and transparent workplace. It's not something that's nice to have. You need to have it. It provides clarity. It protects both the employees and the organizations, and it serves as a critical tool when tough situations arrive, and they will arise. So our next presentation is going to focus on those tough situations and tough decisions. It's going to be acting and recovering. So when a concern escalates into a formal investigation, we're going to explore how to act decisively and fairly during the investigation, but also we need to be able to support our people through the process. Because the truth is, even when handled well, investigations can leave a mark on employees, whether they're directly involved or they're not involved. And it's all about offering help and acting in the right way to help people get through this process. So that's it from my side, and I guess we'll open up for any questions.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Lorianne. Yes, so Accountable Leadership in Action Part 3, the final session on Act and Recover, is on November 17th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I just put the link in the chat. You can click on that and register now. We highly recommend you do that. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but we can run through a few quickly. So one question that we have is, how do I document what my boss is not doing?
Are you going to take that one, John?
Sure. Yeah. So again, and that's really important, because at the end of the day, a great question, because at the end of the day, it's about, what's happening, but also what isn't happening. And if you're not feeling supported through that, because you might be the one that's hauled up on the carpet 6 months from now or a year from now, and they'll be why didn't you act? Because, and you want to be able to, make a clear, a very clear picture of, okay, this is the information I had, and this is what I did with it, right? Because at the end of the day, you only have so much that you can do. Now, I wouldn't suggest putting it in the lunchroom on the bulletin board, your notes on that, so everybody can see it. But if you need to take secure notes, you need something. And I tell you what, it makes is a lot. I would put a lot more weight on a comment. Well, I didn't feel I could do this because my boss wasn't doing this and that. If that was dated 6 months ago, not 5 minutes before you and I discussed this during an investigation, right? So I'd look back and say, oh, it's very clear to me. So great question, but you gotta document it. Just be careful with it.
And also tie it into whatever policies are relevant in your own workplace. So let's just say it had something to do with that person being involved in a harassment related incident or something like that. There's going to be direction in your policy, like say your respectful workplace policy or harassment policies, that speak to what you have to document and who you have to tell if there is some sort of a reporting mechanism. And the same thing goes for some of the ISO frameworks, or even if you're like the designated person ashore working in a maritime environment. If you're aware of something that's happening or not happening, and that needs to be documented, the policy speaks to how it's documented and who it needs to be reported to.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. It's really important to note that for people who are not only leading the investigation, but people who are just a part of it, whether as reporting it or etc. So those are good notes to have. That documentation is important either way. One more question. Do I need someone else to testify?
In what context?
Not sure. Maybe just in the report, do they need someone else to know that it's happening or that it happened or to confirm?
Well, that's something that the investigator is going to do. They're going to look for corroborating evidence. But if there was an incident that needed to be reported, if there were 2 or 3 people there, either 2 or 3 people could do like a separate, let's say there's like an accident form or something in your workplace. Each person could fill that out, would be the best scenario. So then you're not just having one person create a document with their version and then 3 people sign it, because 3 people, it's not all their individual unique thoughts on that. I would recommend the 3 people fill out the form and the 3 people submit it. And if it's a incident where something happened or something was said, and investigators are going to ask you about that, and when you're being interviewed, you always have the right to say, this is what I saw, this is what I did, this is my version of the story. And you can always say, I recommend you speak to these 2 other people because they witnessed it, or they might have something to add, or whatever. And the investigators will make notes of that. John, did you want to add anything to that?
No, you covered it off. Yeah, you
Awesome.
covered it off. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for your time and for your awesome presentation. And thank you everyone for coming. We look forward to seeing you guys again on November 17th for part 3. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.